Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this edition of neighborhoodnewsstudio.com. We have a great lineup today. Kicking it off will be Mr. John O'Loughlin, also known as McDuff. At 12 o'clock, we have investigative journalist George Webb. At 2 o'clock, we have the great Mark Kulak. And at 4 o'clock, we have Chris Hunter, the IP Hunter. How are you doing today, John?
Oh, fine. Thanks, John. How are you?
Good, great. And also with him is Mr. Harley Schlanger. How are you doing today, Harley?
I'm doing fine. Good talking to you.
Yes, it's going to be a very big day today. We have a lot of things lined up. I just want to remind before I exit the stream, I want to remind our viewers that to check out screamingospreys.com, where you have the rest of John's programming, and also the schillerinstitute.com. All right, John, I'll let you take it away.
All right, and thanks very much, John Wilkins, out at the studio in Temperance, Michigan, and from here at Mystery Island in Southern Maryland on the East Coast. I am happy to once again welcome Harley Schlanger to the show, and Harley's been just a terrific correspondent with me for going on a couple years now. Generously making time every couple of weeks to talk to us and bring us up to date. So without further ado, welcome Harley Schlanger.
Hi, John. I'm sorry I missed last week, but I forgot once again the schedule that we didn't switch to daylight time until this last weekend. So glad we could hook up today.
Yeah, no worries. The powers that be just seem determined to screw things up, don't they? I mean, why couldn't they coordinate the European and the American change over to daylight savings time? But they didn't.
If we can have unity to crush Putin, why can't we get the clock on time?
Yeah, that's right. Well, it's getting very close to making the trains run on time, so I'm not sure we want to go that far. I do like the comment made by Robert Anton Wilson about Irish clocks in the train station, and he said they never tell the same time at once. And the Irish station handler told him, well, sure, if they did, one of them would be superfluous.
Good answer.
Irish answer, I think, in a way. Anyway, thanks for being with us again, Harley. And what's on your mind? What's number one?
Well, I want to talk about the regime change strategy of the U.S., which Anton Blinken denied. But before I do, I want to bring up something that I think is very important for both of us, which is one of our dear friends and comrades, Marcia Maluk, is very ill. She's been a colleague of mine for probably 40-something years, very hard worker, courageous woman. She has been taking responsibility for getting the story of the destruction of Yemen out to the American people. And in fact, she's recruited a LaRouche organization inside Yemen, where young people get together and read LaRouche's ideas. They're trying to get Yemen into the Silk Road. And of course, Yemen is one of the targets of the regime change policy of the United States, which Blinken says doesn't exist. So I'd like to just say hello, Marcia. I hope you're well, and I hope you're able to listen to us. And you mean a lot to us, and all the people you've touched in your life owe you a great debt of gratitude.
Harley, I'm sorry to hear this about Marcia Maluk, who's been a part of my life for a couple of years now. She's helped me line up so many of the great guests that we've been able to have here on McDuff Lives. I can't even begin to number all of them, from David, from our friend,
David Shaven.
David Shaven, yeah, or Shavin sometimes. But also Richard Black and I can't even name them all. But the point is, she put in the time to do all the phone calls and the messaging back and forth. But and I haven't really explored her work on Yemen. but what an important thing, and what a fantastic cause to tribute to dedicate yourself to illuminating to the American people the devastation that's being caused in Yemen. So I join you in wishing her, Marcia, well, and thank you for all your great assistance and friendship.
And for those who don't know her, I can assure you she's a very serious person, but also a very loving and dedicated person, and has done a great deal to promote the kinds of ideas that you and I have been discussing for all of her adult life.
All right, well, Marcia Maluk, this show's for you. And with that, Harley, where shall we start?
Well, let's start with the lamentable character of Antony Blinken, moving from the heroic woman, Marcia Maluk, to this crazed character who actually had the audacity to try to walk back Biden's statement where Biden said, we've got to get rid of Putin, more or less. And then one of his handlers came out and said, well, he didn't mean that. He didn't mean regime change. And then Blinken went one step further and said, we are not for regime change in Russia or anywhere else. I mean, his exact quote, I think I have it here somewhere. Anyway, yeah, here it is. We do not have a strategy of regime change in Russia or anywhere else. Now, Blinken, of course, is a protege of the unlamented Madeleine Albright, who I'm sure was greeted very happily by Satan Saturday when she passed away. Blinken worked under Albright. He worked with Biden for many, many years. Blinken was one of the coordinators of the work in Syria, which was a U.S. operation to arm and train Al-Qaeda and ISIS terrorists for regime change against Assad. He knows that. He knows the Russians know that. He knows all the NATO allies know that. So what does it mean when he says something like that? And of course, what else? Going back to the overthrow of Noriega and a regime change, the bombing of Yugoslavia for nearly 3 straight months to get rid of Milosevic, getting rid of Gaddafi, the 2014 coup in Ukraine, and Yemen, of course. This has been the work of the CIA, the so-called deep state. NATO's involved in all of this. And so for Blinken to say that, and following what Biden said in Warsaw, it just confirms for the Russians what they already know, which is that all the US policy in Ukraine is about regime change in Russia. Now, if they didn't know that, a leading apologist for the British Empire by the name of Neil Ferguson, I have his book behind me now called Empire, he wrote a column in Bloomberg where he said, I conclude that the US intends to keep this war going. He said that he was told, a senior administration official said, quote, the only end game now is the end of the Putin regime. And then Ferguson, who's British, finished by saying, I gather that senior British figures are talking in similar terms. There is a belief that the UK's number one option is for the conflict to be extended and thereby bleed Putin. Now, do you think Putin doesn't know that? Of course he does. So when the US is saying the Russians are not negotiating in good faith, well, who continues to arm Ukraine? Who continues to tell Zelensky he's not allowed to accept a settlement? And then who's running around now talking about getting rid of Putin? So I think this is extremely dangerous. You know, it makes the Dulles brothers look like very clever tacticians, doesn't it? I mean, compared to this heavy-handed stuff.
Oh, Mary, just mentioning the Dulles brothers makes my stomach turn a little bit. So I didn't have a ready answer for you, but yeah, you talk about intrigue, but it took the Dulles brothers' intrigue, you know, the cleverly laid intrigue that you mentioned, to get us to the point where this heavy-handed Blinken can actually have a podium to stand on and to make these obviously cynical, but for the consumption of people that don't know that it's cynical. People don't know that what he's saying is clearly based upon lies. And so again, we get back to the question of, what is reality? Is reality what we're seeing on the media? Most of the time, I think it's not.
You have some very interesting insights coming from ex-military people, like Colonel Douglas McGregor, who said that in contrast to the talking heads on the media who say the Russian military is not doing a good job, it's being held off by the Ukrainian people. And, look, I'll start by saying this, John. Nobody wants war. Nobody wants to see innocent people killed or even soldiers kill each other. But the point is that this was provoked by the West. This was provoked by denying legitimate security guarantees to the Russians for almost 2 decades. And it goes back to the initial broken promises after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1990-91, when James Baker told Shevardnadze, the Russian foreign minister, there would be not 1 inch of eastward movement by NATO. And since that time, there's been about 1,000 kilometers eastward march of NATO, and they want to bring Ukraine in now. So there's a hypocrisy from the West. But what we're hearing in the media is that the Russians are being defeated by the heroic Ukrainian resistance. Well, if the Russians wanted to go in and take Kiev, they would do what the US did to Fallujah, what the US did to cities in Afghanistan and Syria and elsewhere. They'd flatten it. They're not doing that. The media shows the same building that was hit by an inadvertent strike over and over and over, saying that this is all of Ukraine. Now, the reality is that the Russians have a different strategy. They're trying to cut off and crush as much as they can of the military capability of the Ukrainian army, and at the same time to denazify Ukraine. Now, I don't know if they're going to be able to do it fully, but the idea that they're losing the war, I mean, McGregor said that's absurd. He said the Russians are doing pretty much what they want to do. Now, Scott Ritter said the same thing. William Arkin, who's a somewhat honest war correspondent, had an article in Newsweek, of all places, echoing McGregor and quoting senior Pentagon officials saying that the media is not telling the truth about the war. So they're not telling the truth about what led to the war or what's going on in the war. Now, at the same time, they keep saying they want to get a settlement. If you want a settlement, stop providing arms to Ukraine. The settlement should be Ukraine should be a neutral country, not part of NATO. And that would be a security guarantee for Russia. At the same time, it's right to demand of Russia that they give security guarantees to Ukraine. So there are ways out of this, but not with the policy that Biden is following. And whether, when Biden says something like, for God's sake, Putin has to go, people say, well, that's an off-the-cuff comment. He was emotional seeing the refugees and everything else. I think he's just reflecting what he hears every day from the circle around him, the so-called Tiger team that was set up to run the policy. So, I think the real question here is, what is the intent of regime change against Putin? And this is what you will never find discussed in the US media, which is the complete panic over the agreement on February 4th between Putin and Xi Jinping for extensive economic and military ties between Russia and China. Because this represents, as Fred Kemp of the Atlantic Council admitted, a tectonic shift. Kemp, who at the Atlantic Council is a leading cheerleader for war, the Atlantic Council is totally funded by Raytheon and all the military industrial complex firms. What Kemp said is that this could be the end of the unipolar order. And what we are seeing, John, you asked what's reality, the unipolar order is crashing. The idea that one country has the right to tell every other country in the world, or one group of countries, one block of countries, the US and NATO, or primarily the US and the UK, can tell everyone else what to do, that's collapsing. And just one perfect example, the British were going to send a delegation to India this week, where they've always had a special relationship in spite of what the British did to the Indians when India was a colony of Britain. Modi sent them home. Modi didn't meet with them. Instead, who did Modi meet with? Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister. The Indians and the Chinese nearly had a war 2 years ago on the border. They haven't had a high-level delegation in Delhi since then, but they had a lengthy meeting, a strategic discussion. We see the same thing with Pakistan. Even Pakistan and India are talking now. And what's the subject? Not having blocks, not having the world divided between a pro-Russia and a pro-Western military operation. So we're seeing a shift, and it's also happening in the economy. And that's what the West is completely in hysterics about. And by the West, I mean the City of London, Wall Street, and the military and think tanks and intellectuals that are funded by that military industrial complex. They don't want this change. It's the end of the project for the new American century, which was declared in 1990. George Herbert Walker Bush called it a new world order. That new world order has crashed. It's not going to exist much longer. The question is, what will replace it? And that's really there. You see China getting India and Pakistan together. And the Prime Minister of Pakistan, Imran Khan, said that he would like to mediate between the US and China. So we have a real opportunity to break out of this order that was set up by the war hawks and the neoliberals. And that's what they don't like. And that's why they're trying to bring down Putin.
You know, as you were mentioning that, my brain was just going, oh, well, we're finally going to listen to the town criers of old, who went around ringing the bells saying, "Hear ye, hear ye." Get it? Ye.
Yep.
We got to listen to ye. Sorry about that. Something about my transmission is not working over to McDuff Lives 3. Perhaps someone in the studio can handle it, because I can't stop the stream and fix it. But apparently McDuff Lives 3 is not receiving the broadcast. So if you could look at that for me, John and Andy, I appreciate it. Okay, go ahead, Harley.
I thought you were referring to hear ye, the British are coming.
Oh, yeah, well,
You hear what happened to the British in Jamaica? Prince William and Princess Kate were there to celebrate the Queen's Diamond Jubilee, and they were told by the president of Jamaica, we want to get out of the British Empire. We don't want the Queen to be our sovereign anymore.
Yeah,
that's part of the new era. Poor countries are basically saying the post-colonial era has been dominated by international banks, which are opposed to the development of our nations. Now you're saying we have to give up whatever sovereignty we have left to this great reset and the Green New Deal. And they're rebelling. I've been on Algerian TV a couple times recently. Blinken, by the way, is going to be in Algeria tomorrow. And he's going to go there to tell them they should give gas to France. And they're going to tell him, no, they're not going to listen to him. The Saudis, even the Saudis, who would ordinarily be the beneficiary of cutting off Russian oil and gas, the Saudis are saying they're not going to do it. And they're talking to the Chinese about accepting the yuan for payment for their oil consumption, which would mean a break with the petrodollar system. So that's what I mean when I say, hear ye, the end is near. It's the unlamentable passing of an order based on the same criminals who assassinated Kennedy, the same criminals who ran Russiagate against Trump, the same criminals who imposed dictatorships around the world and overthrow elected governments. That order is going to be gone soon. And I don't think most of the world is going to cry at its funeral.
It's it's a good. I love the idea of it crashing, of not crashing, but maybe slithering away. Nobody wants to see a crash, which could be horrific. But I think maybe that's what they're doing, is they're getting ready to actually crash the Western financial system, to the benefit of those that have been printing the money in the first place, and
Yeah.
those of us that'll be left holding pieces of paper with pictures of dead presidents. I don't want to be. I don't want to go there. I want my retirement to be secure. I don't think people in the United States are ready for the crash of the dollar and the crash of the Western stock market, which is what you're implying. How can this happen without a disaster to the American people, Harley?
Well, we're already seeing it encroaching on our standard of living with the inflation. The inflation is not caused by anything Putin is doing. It's not caused by the coronavirus. The inflation was caused by a strategy since 1971 to favor investment into the speculative system as a way of making money, as opposed to investment in physical economic production, which is the old-fashioned American system way. Right now, you can hardly get a loan if you want to produce steel, or if you want to set up a new plant to provide electricity to a community, or build a new hospital. But if you want to go out and speculate on the value, on the expected price, I should say, of oil in 3 months or 30 days or 20 minutes, you'll find someone who will loan you the money to go place a bet. We have a speculative system. And to keep the system going, because there's nothing backing it up, nothing backing the dollar. It used to be after 1971, when we ended the gold reserve system. That was done by Nixon, August 15th, 1971. LaRouche warned that we were going to move toward a Schachtian economic policy. Schacht was Hitler's finance minister. And it was Schacht who came up with the idea, the clever idea, of using political prisoners and eventually Jews and others to work for free in concentration camps for Thyssen and Krupp and other German corporations. Now, that strategy is what we're seeing increasingly with the austerity demands that are already coming from people like Klaus Schwab and others. What they're planning, as you mentioned, they'll keep inflating the currency to give cheap dollars to the largest debtors, namely the speculators, so they can keep betting and trading the worthless financial instruments that they have. But in the meantime, the price of everything is going to go to the point where you can't afford anything, if there are even supplies to buy. We're going to see a breakdown now, this time because of the war, of food production. I think 30 to 40% of the grain in the world comes from Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. Fertilizers come from those areas, potash, the natural gas that's used in fertilizer, nitrogen, and so on. The products that we need to survive are in short supply. Then you look at the breakdown of the supply chains for computer chips and things of that sort. We're seeing a loss of everything. This is the Great Reset. And in a sense, it's easier to do this with a war economy where you can say, oh, we have to do this to protect ourselves from the dictator Putin, as opposed to actually just convincing people they have to give up everything for the sake of the speculators. So the Ukraine situation is being used for two things: to stop the alternative system that's coming into place, and as a shock effect to carry out a war economy of austerity and scarcity on the people of Western Europe and the United States. And the Americans who think, well, the war is way over there, it doesn't affect me. I can tell you, when I went to the grocery store 2 days ago in Potsdam, Germany, there's no vegetable oil on the shelves because sunflower seeds and things of that sort, raps oil and things of that sort, come from Ukraine and Russia. It's not there. So we're seeing an austerity regime being put in place to pave the way for people to accept what will become the success of the global central bankers dictatorship called the Great Reset.
All right. How do we win?
We bankrupt them. Now, in a way, that's easy. There's an easy way to do it. The problem is we've got to whip the Congress in the shape to do something. And right now, the Congress is completely in the pockets of the people who are pushing the Great Reset and the war hawks. So this is where the people who are listening to us, the American people, have to take responsibility to create a change. And this means you have to make the Congress more frightened by their constituents than they are that they might lose the flow of money from JP Morgan Chase and Goldman Sachs. This is a big thing, John. It's not going to be easy. But I think if people know that these crises are coming and they're avoidable, but they're coming because of the bankruptcy of the system, we need to put the system in the bankruptcy reorganization. Now, in 1933, when Franklin Roosevelt came in, he was able to get a bill called Glass-Steagall, a banking regulation bill, passed because everyone knew that the banks were responsible for the speculative excesses of the 20s, the so-called roaring 20s, that led to the collapse of the stock market, and then 2 years later, the banking system. And so Roosevelt was able to push that through. But to do it, he had to use things like the Pecora Commission, where they actually did an investigation of what JP Morgan had done, how the utility companies were tied to City National Bank and JP Morgan. And so they actually created in congressional hearings an understanding that the banks were running a crooked operation, looting the population. Now, it's even worse today. The bankers in the 20s will look like saints when you see what Goldman Sachs and Fink of BlackRock and others have been doing with the printing presses of the Federal Reserve. But people don't know that. People don't even know that the Federal Reserve is not a government agency, that it's essentially owned and controlled by the private banks who issue government credit, so-called, that they buy and sell for a profit, which give you the dollars that you have to spend. What happens when those dollars don't go back into the economy and just go into the speculative economy? Well, you have billionaires living it up while the rest of us are digging into our old pants pockets to try and find enough money to go out and get a loaf of bread.
Already, and it's just going to get worse. And how I don't see, like my congressman is Steny Hoyer. Okay, there's no way that I'm ever going to change Steny Hoyer. He's going to be himself until he decides to retire, and he's not going to retire until he's ready. And there's nothing that anybody, constituents in Southern Maryland, can do about that if they wanted to. It would take incredible amounts of money and a media effort of huge proportions.
Well, it might take something else, though, John. What if a large number of people began to realize that they were going to lose their homes, they'd lose their jobs, lose their ability to feed their children, take care of their grandchildren? Because that's what we're headed toward. We're headed toward a crisis that's far more profound than what we saw in 2008, a true breakdown crisis. Now, the problem is that on the one hand, people aren't aware of that yet. People are feeling the pinch. When gas prices go up, you hear people complain, but what can you do about it? Well, at a certain point, you're going to have people out in the streets. People are going to be extremely unhappy. And I don't think they're going to blame Vladimir Putin for it. And the question then is, do we have enough people who will tell them the truth about who caused this and why and what can be done about it? And just on this point on Steny Hoyer, he reminds me a little bit in terms of the arrogance of him and the arrogance of these great, powerful leaders like Schumer. They remind me of Erich Honecker. Now, I don't know if people remember the name, but he was the dictator of the East German Democratic Republic, which was essentially the Soviet counterpart in Eastern Germany. And people in East Germany generally had it better than most of the rest of the East Bloc, but they didn't have anything close to the standard of living of people in West Germany. And they could peer over the wall in East Berlin into West Berlin and see a vibrant city while they were living under terrible conditions. Honecker, in October 1989, proclaimed that the East German state would last for 1,000 years. A month later, the wall came down. 6 weeks later, Honecker was in a hospital, I think in either Chile or Peru, and the East German Democratic Republic crashed. They had the most extensive police state apparatus, even more so than the KGB. They had 1 out of 3 people in East Germany, and 1 out of 3 in East Berlin, and maybe 1 out of 3 in the whole of East Germany, were on the payroll of the Stasi, the secret police, reporting on their neighbors. When I first moved to Potsdam, because Potsdam is in Eastern Germany, was part of East Germany, you'd see older people staring out of their windows of their apartments, and you'd ask people, well, why are so many people doing that? And they said, maybe it's an old habit from when they were spying on each other. This was a reality. But what happened is that small numbers of people, courageous people, protested every Monday night at their churches, especially in Leipzig, in Dresden. And the Stasi watched them, they kept an eye on them, and all of a sudden it went from 10 people to 100 people, from 100 people to 1,000. And when it got to 1,000, the word was sent out, next week go out and crack some heads. But the next week there were 10,000 in some cities, there were as many as 50,000, I think, in Leipzig. And all of a sudden the slogan, Wir sind das Volk, we are the people, reverberated in the so-called People's Democratic Republic, and the East German regime collapsed. Now, we're bought off in the West by the generally better standard of living that we've been accustomed to, but as we're seeing that shrink, what holds us back? Social media, sports, entertainment. Why did Will Smith smack Chris Rock? This is what people are focused on, not the fact that we might have a nuclear war with Russia. But I think as things worsen, we'll have an opportunity. And the Steny Hoyers, who see themselves as the masters of the universe today, are going to eventually be met in the same way in 2016. We saw somewhat of an uprising against the elites of the Democratic Party with the Trump election. And by the way, it was also a victory over the elites of the Republican Party. So, I think we've got to keep telling the truth and give people a sense of what's possible. And perhaps we'll have something in the American people, that old-fashioned American optimistic spirit that we must be able to do better than this, can galvanize a movement. The Schiller Institute's holding a conference on April 9th, where we're starting the process of convening a conference to establish a new security architecture and a new financial architecture. And I'd encourage every one of our viewers and listeners to go to the schillerinstitute.com website and register for that conference and join us in organizing it, because this is the one opportunity that we may have to defeat this oligarchy, which otherwise has had its way since the assassination of President Kennedy.
Yes, they have, and that was, in my view, to get the American people to understand that was a regime change operation, and that the nation that we knew became in the past, and a new government was imposed upon us, which is not run by, for, and of the people, but it's run by, for, and of the clients of Sullivan and Cromwell, to put it in this nutshell as best as I can, and that extends to Europe, But here's the problem, Harley. They have done such a good job of dividing Americans,
Yeah.
such as the Oscar presentation, which I didn't look at, except for I love Wanda Sykes. She's very funny. But but there was three women there that presented, and basically what it was I'm the black person, I'm the disabled person, I'm the sheepishly embarrassed white person who wishes they weren't white, and they just go through that whole identity politics, and identity politics will keep the white people of the suburbs from joining with the black people of the inner city to do that protest that you need. I think Washington, D.C. right now seems like almost foreign country to me. I don't expect the police to be fair to me. I certainly do not expect the mayor to be fair to me. And I think the whole jurisdiction has been taken over by these same people. Maybe New York is different. I guess New York has always been a place where there's so many intelligent people that perhaps they will rise up. But it's not going to happen in Washington, D.C., and I don't think it's going to happen in most of the cities around this country. It's just, now Europe is different. You've been living in Europe for a while, and wow, I love to see the people out on the streets. And when they're
well, it's not hard to get people in the streets in Europe. You have French farmers spraying manure on city council houses, the houses of mayors. Look, just in the last week, the truckers are on strike in northern France and Normandy, in parts of Germany and Italy. What's the issue? The issue is they can't afford fuel. They can't afford the gas anymore. Germany has much higher gas prices because of the taxes. The fishermen are on strike in Italy and Spain. There are people still protesting vaccine mandates, people protesting the banks in Italy. In Greece, they're protesting the government. And the problem is that the difference between the United States and Europe is that for every different identity group, there's a political party in Europe. In the United States, we have two parties that are really one party controlled from the top. So people tend to go off in different anarchistic modes for the narrow interest that attracts them. But I think that breaks down under conditions when the social fabric starts to fray. And to me, one of the important things about what happened in 2016, whether Trump was the solution or not, he spoke to the anger of people who were watching these endless wars and having a sense that they had no control over what the policy was. And we began to see a change in the population. And I think we had a missed opportunity between 2016 and 2020. And why that happened is something that could be debated endlessly. But what we've now seen as a result of that is most people don't trust the media. All the media layers, the Nielsen ratings have collapsed. Most people don't trust most politicians. The Congress has a very low approval rating. Biden's approval rating is falling through the floor. But who's stepping in as a national leader to replace him? Well, this is where you see the opportunity. And this is also why you see censorship and lies and the importance of shutting down alternative voices. But I think what we need is what Trump appealed to was a sense of national mission. Now, someone who appealed to that even more powerfully was John Kennedy in his 1960 campaign and Ronald Reagan in his 1980 and 1984 campaigns. The idea that we have a national mission to develop our nation to the greatest extent possible. Now, whether Reagan had all the policies for that, I think he was too much controlled by the neoliberals. But this is where the fight has to be. We need to expose the corruption of the neoliberals and the neoconservatives. And that gets to just the other point, John. What most Americans don't realize is the power of the British Empire. It still exists. and exists in a big way in controlling our intelligence community, the national dialogue coming from the media, the political parties. And in my daily update today, I went through somewhat of a progression going back to the post-Kennedy period. Who shaped American foreign policy during that time? You had Kissinger, you had Brzezinski, you had Madeleine Albright, who was a protege of Brzezinski. You have Susan Rice, Condoleezza Rice, who comes from the Schultz Network. All of this is one school, and one of the key people in shaping it was a British agent, William Yandell Elliott, a professor at Harvard, whose students included Kissinger, Brzezinski, and Samuel Huntington of the Clash of Civilizations. And this is how the British shaped the discussion in both parties, in the media. And that's why I brought up this guy, Neil Ferguson. He's one of these historians who writes nostalgically about how things were much simpler when there was an empire, while at the same time covering up the fact that the empire still exists. And you know very well, what were the Dulles brothers and Sullivan and Cromwell? They were intimately connected to the Bank of England and the court politics of the Royal Institute of International Affairs and the Chatham House, these kinds of agencies. Today, the Atlantic Council is one of these think tanks. The Henry Jackson Society, a British neocon think tank that took its name from an American Democratic neocon, former Senator Scoop Jackson, Henry Jackson. So it's an Anglo-American network, and they won't give up the idea of empire, even if it means going to the brink of nuclear war. And I think if people get a sense that the misery that we're about to experience, if this war policy continues and the war economy is consolidated, is because of this network. And we've got to identify it, and we've got to give people a sense of what the real alternative is.
Yeah, that's what we need. We need an alternative. And here in the United States, there's not an alternative. I think, when you call for the American people to maybe hit the streets or rise up or make a big noise somehow, I think they tried to do that on January 6th. And the people that went down there are the people that you're talking to. Say, you guys have that American spirit in your hearts. You need to rise up and say, that they've stolen your government. They've blackmailed your Congress. They've taken your financial system and turned it into a cash cow for the elite. They've done all these horrible things, and you've got to get up and stand up. To quote Bob Marley, get up, stand up, don't give up your rights. Well, they tried. Many friends of mine went down there, people with good hearts and good intentions. And would they go again? If someone were to call for a rally in Washington, D.C.? Well, the whole truck thing just happened and fizzled out. They did drive a number of trucks across the country and rolled around the interstate around the Beltway, around Washington, D.C., to try to make a point, but they got no press, none at all. Canada, they had a successful press event, but in Washington they didn't. And that's just because everything seems to me to be so controlled. We're already so deeply under the thumb of this blob, or whatever you want to call it.
Blob is a good word.
Yeah, blob is a word that Garland Nixon and I were using a couple months ago, and then I saw it written by Michael Hudson, formerly of the Hudson Institute, who's been he's written some very interesting blogs lately. Speaking of bloggers, over at Substack, I've started to get interested in folks over there, and I wonder if you have run across yet Riley Wagaman, who broadcasts under the pseudonym of Edward Slavsquat on Substack. The reason that I call your attention to him is I've had him on the show once. He's a young journalist living in Moscow with a young family, and he's there to try to tell us what's going on. And but the main thing that I get from him is that he is scared, and the people there in Moscow are afraid of what's going to happen. How much confidence do you have, Harley, that Putin is acting in behalf of the Russian people?
Well, here's the interesting thing. There are a number of people who have written columns in the last couple of days, including the president of, or the chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations, Richard Haas, saying that by Biden saying this thing about regime change, he's strengthening Putin in Russia, because the Russian people have had a view that this is what America wants. They want to get rid of Putin. They want to control Russia. And where does that come from? Well, the great moment again in 1989 to 91, when there could have been a change in Russia. Instead, the West went in triumphantly, looted the place to the bone. And I mean looted. They took over Russian manufacturing. And if you had any competent industry, they just took it over and moved it. They shut down factories. They destroyed a skilled labor force. They stole the raw material wealth. And they chose a handful of people to become oligarchs who became partners with American bankers and British bankers, people like William Browder, one of the big thieves of the end of the 19th or 20th century. And so Russia went through a demographic collapse where the death rate was higher than the birth rate for almost 20 years as a result of these policies. And Putin has been working to bring it back up. And we've seen the emphasis on science and technology. And people in Russia do feel much better about their circumstances. So you start hitting them with sanctions. And what does it say to them? Why is America against us? So I think what Haas was saying and a few others, don't give Putin the raw material to prove that his quote unquote paranoia is right. Well, it's not paranoia. They are trying to get rid of Putin. And to the extent that there's a support for improvement of living standards in Russia, they see Putin as their champion. Now, the other side of that is the Putin-Xi Jinping relationship, which is an integration of Eurasia with China, which includes Central Asia. It includes all the Stan countries, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, some of which have a lot of raw material wealth. India and Pakistan are on the rise. And in a sense, we're moving into an Asian century, which is why Obama tapped people like Blinken and Sullivan to come up with the so-called pivot to Asia away from Europe in the second term of Obama. And that was hampered by the fact that we were in all these wars. So Trump came in to get us out of those wars. And what does Biden do? Biden tries to move NATO to Asia. But at the same time, the attempt to weaken Russia and break Russia from China. The reason I'm going through this in some depth is that you ask, what is the potential for an uprising in the West? We have to look to our natural allies. India had an anti-colonial rebellion against the British, not quite like the American Revolution, but what Gandhi did with the nonviolent movement, and then what Nehru did and Indira Gandhi to make it to manufacturing power, was an American-style transformation of India. We see something similar in Pakistan. We see it in Nigeria. We see it in South Africa, Argentina. Around the world, there are countries that have tremendous potential that have been held back by this Anglo-American control of the money. And they look now to Russia and China as a possibility to break this control. While the American people are being told Putin's the boogeyman, Xi Jinping is the dictator. Now, I'm not saying everything in Russia and China are great, but I'm saying they recognize something that most Americans haven't figured out yet, which is that the billionaire class, the Davos crowd, the Wall Street crowd, the City of London crowd are the enemies of the American system. Self-consciously are deploying to prevent a revival of the American economic system, which requires banking separation, national bank, a real national bank, not a private central bank, but a real national bank that's a credit generation agency for physical economic production. So we have a potential alliance around the world to break the power of these bankers. And I think that's a message that if the American people got, instead of seeing all these people who don't look like us as our enemies, they'd realize that in the past, the American system inspired these countries. They wanted to be like America. Now they're not so sure they want to be like America. And we've got to become like America again.
Yes, we do. And, it does go back to the same thing, the Dulles brothers and Sullivan and Cromwell takeover of our government is secret takeover, in which the American people's will has been completely disregarded and crushed under a mountain of emergency legislation that never goes away, the Patriot Act, all of these things that are taking away all the rights that we were given by our founding fathers, and just sweep them off the table, and you don't need those rights anymore. We're going to take care of you from cradle to grave. We're going to take care of you, the nanny state. And it never works.
He makes it into permanent infants. That's the key to the nanny state. You become infantilized.
Isn't it remarkable? I know we're getting close to the end of the show, but isn't it remarkable when you think back about the objections that the agricultural, the Thomas Jefferson side of things made, which was exactly that if you let everybody, all the people will work in a city, they'll all work in a factory, they'll all lose their ability to think, they'll lose their ability to be independent. And that was the great objection philosophically against the industrialization of the country that was fought, and in some ways is still being fought by those that would rather have an agrarian plantation style existence. That great war between the agriculturalists, which Yandell Elliott, I think, comes from that.
The agrarian school, exactly.
And the agrarian school, and then the Sullivan and Cromwell school, which is monetize everything as fast as you possibly can and just crush everything into dollars.
And those two work together. That's the amazing thing. Yandell Elliott's operations were funded by the Sullivan and Cromwells and the Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan Chase.
Yeah.
Well, John, if we are running out of time, I just want to encourage people again. If you are thinking about what we're discussing and want to do something, if you go to the schillerinstitute.com website, you'll see the invitation and the registration for our conference on April 9th. And I'm not sure if we're going to be doing another program to get back on the old schedule or not before then, like next week. But I would urge people, register for the conference, read the material, the supporting material, and if you agree with it, sign the petition and organize your friends, neighbors, coworkers, fellow churchgoers, and so on, so that we can actually restore this sense of a national mission. Not just for the United States, but the national mission of the Founding Fathers was to be a light to the world, to show that Republican institutions can work, and that the principles embedded in our Constitution are universal principles of natural law, not unique just to people born in America, but which every nation can aspire to. But to do that, you need sovereign nations where the people of those nations make the policy. And we've got to restore our own sovereignty.
We have got to restore our own sovereignty. And David Underdown, our great contributor, says, United Fruit, it's more than just bananas. Absolutely. All right, Harley, thanks very much again. And thanks, everyone, for being with us. Stick here on Neighborhood News Studio for the next show, which I believe, Andy, is going to be George Webb. Am I right?
Yes, sir, indeed. Great show, fellas. We all appreciate the Harley's input from the Schiller Institute. Make sure you do go to schillerinstitute.com and register for that event. They're always fun, and you learn a lot. You guys do great work over there, and just
Well, thank you, Andy.
yeah, thank
And
you.
You're doing good work too.
I signed the petition, and I urge everyone else to sign it too. Nobody else is doing this. We've got to find some way to have a forum to put people together and knock heads and get these things thrashed out, settled, and behind us, so we can get back to being, free. Thanks, everyone.
All right, fellas. You guys have a good one.
And I'll play the ostrich here for Baker's mother. There you are. Bye now.
See you, John. Thank you once again to John O'Loughlin and Harley Schlanger. You can go to screamingospreys.com. It's actually written on the bottom of the screen, still on the banner, to get all your McDuff updates. Let me throw that on the screen real quick. We're transitioning here. Go to screamingospreys.com. And as you can tell, they got the live feed into the beautiful hatchlings that were just born. Sometimes you get to watch the